Hi, my name is Mikhail Heisinger, and I'm looking at the Inside the Black Box WebEx. So, going through their presentation, answering their discussion questions. So, starting with Sarah's questions here, she goes with the overview and then her questions. So, based off that first statement, I think that it's great that we're using formative assessments to raise um, the students that are struggling and the low achievers. I do agree that more can be done to promote the growth of all students. So I think it would be important to provide some challenging tasks for students who seem to be at average or even above average. Instead of, I feel like we sometimes just focus on those students that are struggling after formative assessments and think about what we can do for them, but keeping a broader picture in mind and wondering about what we can do about all students when you're doing that reflection time. I do feel like frequent assessment feedbacks helps to enhance learning. I think when students are given more information of their understanding, that it helps. Sometimes I feel like if I go too long between assessing students, that sometimes they don't realize their own gaps in their understanding. So I think having those more frequent assessments not only helps me of knowing where students are at, but it also allows students to get a better feel of where they're at as well. So this last question goes back to the first one. I do think it's important to push and challenge students who are performing at above average levels. So I think this can come in by allowing more choice in some of the tasks and providing tasks that allow for some more creativity or challenge in the classroom. That way, those students that are excelling have a chance to continue to excel and continue to grow as learners. So some more of Sarah's questions here. So some strategies that I use in my classroom to give feedback and advice. In order for students to take in the advice, one thing I'll do when I'm grading projects is that I only put feedback on the rubrics. Some things that they did really well, some highs, but also some wondering, some questions, some areas that they can improve on. And then I don't put the grade on those rubrics. Instead, later that day, I'll put the grade in on PowerSchool. That way, students, I'll give them a couple minutes in class. They go through and they read that feedback, and it allows them to think through that before immediately seeing the grade that they got on that project. I think that's worked really well. So, for her second question, so as a teacher, to help learn about my students and their learning styles, one thing I try and do a lot of at the beginning of the year is do a lot of reflection of providing a lot of different tasks and just making notes about different students, what seems to go well with them, what seems to not go well for them. And then also doing surveys throughout the year at the end of each unit of what are some highlights for them, what are some areas that they felt like they excelled, what are some areas that they felt like they struggled in the project. And by reading some of those feedback surveys, I learn a lot about my students and how they learn best. So, state testing on my instruction, the only state test that I am really concerned about is the SAT. So, I do kind of incorporate what I want to teach around the SAT, occasionally knowing some important topics that I have to hit, as well as including some SAT practice questions as warm ups or put them on a test or a quiz. That way, students are used to seeing them and they're not surprised when they start taking the SAT. So, moving on to Caitlin's questions about how we can improve formative assessments. So, this statement is very similar to an article that I read for another one of my classes that talked about these extrinsic rewards, such as candy, stuff like that, that you'll sometimes give students if they do really well on a task. And it really talks about how when you do that, it takes away from your creativity that students might have at that task instead of focusing on how it being a rich task and focusing on how students can grow through the task. Instead, students are just focused on what that reward is. So I think I want to be more careful of not constantly assigning a reward with tasks and instead um, just promote them and their knowledge and creativity and hope that that will um, kind of get better results, I guess. One kind of way that I see students motivated a lot is this fear of failure, which is also, I believe, a culture focus of Most students, they're so scared of failing and the consequences of failing that sometimes they just won't try. That way, it's easier than trying and failing. So I see this fear motivating students positively sometimes, but often very negatively as well. So, going to our second question of what do you do to grow a culture of success in your classroom or work environment? So, one thing I really trying to do in my classroom is develop a growth mindset. That growth mindset really tries to diminish that motivation of fear and take these fears of mistakes away. That way, instead, students see mistakes as a way to grow. And when students can make that shift, I think they become less motivated by fear. And then that culture of success starts to grow a little bit more in the classroom. So, going to Caitlin's next questions. So, for self and peer assessment in my classroom, I do a lot of self assessment. I have students reflect often. At each quiz, some or each unit, at least once in a while for quizzes, I'll have students take some time and self reflect on each of the learning targets we've covered so far and reassess if it's something that they can always do, sometimes do, or never do. And then based on their responses, I have that kind of help me in deciding how we're going to spend reviewing. And then also, I provide students with resources. That way, based on how they assess themselves, they know which areas that they should be studying for a little bit more. We also do some self and peer assessment for projects before I have students turn projects in. I give them the same rubric that I'm going to grade them on, and I have them go through and grade their projects themselves. I've noticed that this really helps promote ownership. And it also allows students to make some of the last minute fixes because they're realizing themselves some areas that they missed. So going to the next question. Um, so this can be tricky. Um, I agree that students have a hard time self-assessing if it's not something that they're believing in. So I really think if you can get that buy-in from students by making material more applicable, more engaging, having them be active in that learning, then they're going to be more likely to reflect on their learning because they're an active part of it. So this is one area that I'm really trying to work on and focus this year is to promote discussion and dialogue in my classroom. So my goal is to have every student talk about math every day, not necessarily in front of the whole class, but at least in their groups. So I'm going to be very intentional of the things that I do at the beginning of class. I want to get students talking right away. So have 3 to 5 minute tasks that students will first think about themselves for a minute. So throw a problem on the board or some puzzle, and they need to think about it for a minute. This allows them to get an answer themselves. And then I'm going to give them a couple minutes to talk in their groups so they get to share what they thought about. And then after groups have talked with one another, I'm going to have designated people, so having it be different people in the group every day, then share it with the class. So hopefully in doing this, while not every student's going to share it to the whole class, every student's at least talked within their group. So it gets students talking right away. And it gets them more comfortable. That way, as we move through the classroom on maybe some new, harder material, students are more likely to be engaged and willing to discuss what's going on. So for tests and quizzes in my classroom, I do not provide a lot of feedback. I really don't provide any feedback because students have the chance to reassess. Therefore, in quizzes, they can go through and correct their quizzes to earn points back. And then on tests, they go back and correct it and then retake the test. So the reason I don't provide feedback is if I'll mark a problem wrong, then students have to go back and figure out what did they do wrong, what do they need to do to fix that problem? Instead of me telling them what they did wrong, that's part of the thought process for them is they need to decide for themselves where they went wrong to fix it. I found that this is helpful because it gets students to be assessing their understanding even more. I realized if I just write something on their paper, they're not necessarily going to read it. So by having them go through those thought processes, I think it makes the learning more meaningful. All right, going to Matt's questions about collaboration. So at my school, we do collaborate a lot amongst grade levels. We have weekly grade level check-ins where we talk about student concerns, but also talk about what ways we can incorporate projects together. That way we can get some more cross-curricular projects going on. So I found a lot of value in those grade level meetings, and then we do similar things for departments. So as a math team, we'll meet um, quite as often, at least once a month, and talk about what we're doing in our classroom and try and build some common themes throughout all of our classrooms. One thing we're going to focus on this upcoming year is adding spiral review into each of our tests. In other words, adding questions from previous units or even previous courses. That way we can try and make sure we're hitting some of those important topics often. I think by collaborating with one another, I've learned a lot of different strategies to use in my classroom, and a lot of these strategies can be used as formative assessment. So it's really good to have those relationships with other teachers so you can continue to learn what works with students. So Matt's last question here. I believe summative and formative should be kept together. They both have the same goal of getting a better understanding of where our students are, what their knowledge is, what their understanding is, and what areas still need to be addressed. So while there are differences in summative and formative, I think overall they're both checks for understanding, and then I would keep them together. So last question here. So changes can only um, happen um, uh, based on the teachers and the students in the classroom. They're the ones who control if change is going to happen. And I think the way this happens for teachers, it's important to have clear expectations of your students. So if we want to raise the standards, students need to know what we expect of them. If we have low expectations, they're going to meet those low expectations. However, if we raise those expectations and communicate those expectations to students, they're going to raise those expectations. So clear expectations and communication is very important. I also think it's important to challenge students. When students get bored, they're not gonna contribute to your classroom. So if we can challenge students, I think that's gonna continue to raise the standards.